chapter. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. Last week we had the opportunity to talk about the calling of the fishermen apostles, Peter and Andrew and James and John. We talked about our love for fish stories. I shared with you my little dive into the canal as a boy when I was fishing. And we talked about how we are called by our baptisms to be fishers of people. And that in the changing waters of today, that there is a challenge for us to ask the question, are we fishing? Are we fishing in the right place? Are we fishing with the right bait? And as I wrote that sermon and as I preached it last week, I knew that the waters that surround us here at St. Paul's were churning and changing. And in this past week, the delegates of Long Island Lutheran made the decision that at the end of this school year, our partner school, Lou Day, across the parking lot, would officially close and no longer reach forward with that mission and with that ministry. Permit me a moment of history to share with you how we've gotten to this point where the waters around us are changing. Throughout the history of this church, from its start over 100 years ago, reaching out and ministry to young people, to youth, has been of the highest priority in this church. And that took on a new meaning in 1969 when the leaders of the church took the bold step of purchasing what used to be known as the Vernon Valley Inn, the building that's across the street in the parking lot. So they renovated the building, and in 1972, St. Paul's Nursery Preschool came into existence. Less than 10 years later, seeing the needs and the growth of the community, that preschool ministry then grew into elementary school ministry, and that continued for nearly 30 years. But with the coming of the new millennium, the 21st century, there were a lot of changes that happened. We're aware of many of them. There was September 11th, there was the downturn in the economy in 2008, and there were some internal parish difficulties. So as we approached the year 2010, there was struggle when it came to continuing that school ministry. How could we best do it and serve the community without crippling the church? So the leaders again of this church, by the grace and the leadings of God, took a progressive and risky step. Seeing how so many children from the St. Paul School would go off to Long Island Lutheran High School, they approached Lou High and asked, would you be willing to connect with us, partner with us, take over the school ministry, and expand your own ministry so that now you're a preschool to a 12th grade. So in 2010, this agreement was arranged and entered into, and things moved forward in a blessed and powerful way. So what happened? Well, in no way was the decision from this past week a reflection anyway on the quality of the product, the staff that's there, or the mission that's before us. It truly is a result of a changing environment, waters that are churning and changing around us. We are in the center of some incredible school districts, public school districts, that a lot of us pay high taxes for, and it's becoming increasingly difficult in today's Long Island economy for young families to pay taxes and tuition on top of that. But the biggest hurdle that is the one that probably contributed the most to where we are today and couldn't be overcome was the decision by the Northport School District back in the fall of 2015 to move to full-day kindergarten. Prior to that, when it was St. Paul's and then Lou Day, the average kindergarten class over across the parking lot was 50 children. After that decision, it was now 15 children on average, and this year's class is 11 kindergarten children. When I first was called to come here as a pastor 5 years ago almost, and so excited being a Lou High grad that this is where I would be, the enrollment over at Lou Day was 246 children. This year the enrollment is 129 children, almost half of what it was 5 years ago. So it would be easy for us to sit here and dwell in the sadness and the depression of this decision. We could go on analyzing how we got here like an endless autopsy. But as the baptized children of God, we are not people of Good Friday. We are people of Easter. And the assurance that we have as the people of God is that when the world changes around us, especially as the result of sin and brokenness, when we let God lead us, when we listen to God speak to us, God will always lead us to where we need to go. When trouble arises, God speaks clearly. And that's the message that's brought to us today in all of our readings. In the Old Testament reading, finally after 40 years of wandering around in the wilderness, the Israelites are coming upon the change they had been waiting for in their life. They're finally about to enter into the promised land. But this moment that they so longed for and journeyed to wasn't without its own issues. Moses was dying. They were uncertain of who was going to lead them. They didn't know what life was going to be like in the new land, and they didn't know what forces awaited them once they crossed over. So in the midst of their anxiety, God reminds them that a prophet will be raised up to lead them, and they needed to listen to the words of the prophet, lead them into the promised land. In the epistle lesson, St. Paul's talking to the young church at Corinth. They now have the incredible freedom that their Christianity gives to them, but it's creating a tension and problem. They are interpreting their freedom as a Christian to do anything they want. And St. Paul has to remind them that being a child of God isn't the freedom to do whatever you want, whenever you want to do it. But it's really exactly the opposite. We are free from the issues and struggles of the world when we let God lead us and listen to what God has laid down for us. And in the gospel lesson, as Jesus begins his ministry and comes to the town of Capernaum, he encounters this man possessed by an evil spirit. And we see that healing of the man takes place when Jesus speaks and the spirit is silent and it's cast out of the man. And that's one of the most important things that we can remember. When sin brings change into our lives and challenges are put before us, that it's most vital that we are silent and patient and listen to the voice of God lead us and guide us. Because God's endless promise to us is that when we listen, he will lead us to where we need to go. So where do we go from here? Well, we listen. We struggle. We let God lead us and guide us with the assurance that God keeps his promises. We are already in the midst of looking into whether or not we can, as St. Paul's, take over the preschool and continue to have a preschool ministry over there. I have been immersed over the last 3 weeks in numbers and all sorts of discussions around this. And if we're going to do this, we have to make a decision quickly because we don't want to lose the momentum that exists already over there with the existing children in the preschool. This is not a decision that we can say, all right, we're going to let everything close down and maybe 2 years, 3 years from now decide whether or not we want to have a school again. This is a decision we'll have to make by the end of February. We're also looking at other possibilities, how that building can be a blessing to the community and carry forth the mission that God has placed before us. So perhaps there is a way we can be an extension of the Lutheran Counseling Center or of Lutheran Social Services. Maybe there are needs of senior citizens that the building could be used for. Maybe it can become a place where English as a second language is taught. Maybe there's something in your heart that you are passionate about, where maybe you feel God calling you to think about ways that we can better serve the community that is around us. So time will tell, and God will lead us. I know that any time in our lives when a chapter ends, there is sadness. But when one chapter and one book ends, we get the opportunity to pick up a new book. And we all, as children of God, read from the greatest author of all. Our story as people of faith doesn't end at the cross on Good Friday, but starts over at the empty tomb of Easter. So we move forward, we listen to God lead us, we trust in God's promises, and we know that God will lead us to where the fish are found. Amen.